Hi there, boys and girls. Here we are again for Lesson 8, the Pilgrims Part II, Thanksgiving Celebration. And this part we're going to be looking in our reader. And today's primary focus is asking and answering questions in writing requiring literal recall and understanding of the Pilgrims Part II, Thanksgiving Celebration by explicitly referring to the text. Okay, we're working on that recall today, going back into the text. Here is our vocabulary words. Foreigner, a person who is living in a country that is not his or her homeland, and tribe, a large group of people who live in the same area and have the same language, customs, and beliefs. Alrighty, let me get right into the chapter over here. Gotta move down here to get to the correct chapter. We want chapter 11 right here. Okay, chapter 11, the Pilgrims Part II, Thanksgiving Celebration. Do you remember that in the previous chapter, you met the Pilgrim children, Mary and Remember Allerton and Love and Wrestling Brewster? In the beginning of the story, they were collecting firewood and playing in the forest. Then you traveled back in time and learned how they had arrived in Plymouth, Massachusetts. In this chapter, we will continue to find out more about their early experiences in Plymouth. Years earlier, the arrival of the children and the other pilgrims in Plymouth in 1621 had not gone unnoticed. Native Americans had watched them from the safety of the forest. They had watched as these foreigners worked to build shelters by day and returned to their ship by night to sleep. Illustration of Native Americans watched Mary, Remember, and their father bury their mother. They had watched as they shivered in the cold. They had watched as they buried their dead in the still of the night. Mary, Remember, Love, and Wrestling had watched too and had wondered if they would survive. Although there were many hardships, there were two things that enabled them to survive. A native tribe called the Patuxet, so like a tongue twister, who had lived in the area, had created fields for planting. Sadly, many members of this tribe had died because they had caught diseases from European explorers. Because of this, their fields were not in use. This meant that the hungry and weary English colonists did not have to clear the forest before planting time. Having experienced the loss of his own people, a Native American called Squanto came to the aid of the Pilgrims. Squanto's friend Samoset agreed to help too. Both of these Native Americans spoke English. Squanto spoke very good English. In 1605, he had been taken to England by an English explorer. Here's an illustration of Squanto and Samoset helping the Pilgrims. Squanto and Samoset showed the Pilgrims how to plant corn, squash, and beans, and how to make these crops grow in the poor soil. Squanto also taught people to recognize berries and fruits that could be eaten and where the best places to fish were. Wrestling Brewster often talked about how he had feared these people at first. But when they helped the settlers, Wrestling had changed his mind. Love and Wrestling had gone fishing with Squanto. Squanto gave the Pilgrims hope. The colonists had also made peace with a local tribe called the Wampanoag. Both sides agreed to help and protect each other. They agreed to trade with each other too. This meant that the colonists could work on building their homes without the fear of attack. Illustration of Squanto and Samoset showed the Pilgrims how to make crops grow in poor soil. Slowly the days grew warmer and the Pilgrims became happier. They were no longer cold and hungry. The first fall was one of the most precious memories Mary, Remember, Love, and Wrestling had. The crops had grown well, and their harvest was abundant. Besides farming, the colonists had also learned how to hunt and fish in this new land. As a result, they had produced more than enough food to get them through the next winter. They had also been able to build homes that would protect them from the cold weather when it came again. While they mourned the loss of so many, the surviving colonists were thankful for what they now had. That is why they decided to give thanks to God and the native people who had helped them. Here's an illustration of an abundant harvest. A great celebration of Thanksgiving was organized. The local Wampanoag were invited to the Thanksgiving celebration. Squanto and Samoset were invited too. The Wampanoag chief, Massasoit, was the guest of honor. Everyone there had dined on deer, duck, lobster, fish, cornbread, pumpkin, squash, and berries. They had eaten until they were fuller than they had ever been before. They had played games and they had run races. The Wampanoag had stayed in the colony for several days. It was probably the happiest time the children could ever remember. They often spoke of it. Since then, more and more pilgrims had arrived. More homes had been built. Their father had married Mistress Fear. All these early experiences of the children happened 4 years ago. Now, here the children were, playing in the forest in a new world. So, illustration of a celebration of Thanksgiving. As Mary and Remember hurried out of the forest, they said their goodbyes to Love and Wrestling. Minutes later, they arrived at the door to their house. Their arrival had not gone unnoticed. The door to their house was flung open, and Mistress Fear appeared in the doorway. She stood there with her hands on her hips. "It's a good thing I had already collected firewood earlier in the day, or the fire would have gone out long ago," exclaimed Mistress Fear. "Anyone would think you had to grow the tree before cutting it down. Now go wash your hands and help me set the table." Mary and Remember looked at each other as they inched past Mistress Fear. They both knew she was not done scolding them. Why do you think Squanto and Samoset had decided to help the struggling pilgrims? Do you think the pilgrims would have survived if they had not helped? Some things to think about before you get into your questions for retelling today's story. Make sure you go back into the text, boys and girls. Have a good Thursday.